All right, welcome everyone. My name is Kaylee Richards. I am the Juvenile Justice Specialist for the Utah Board of Juvenile Justice. And today's presentation will be myself and Brett Peterson from Juvenile Justice Youth Services, as well as Van Nguyen, who is a research consultant for the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. We are here today to review the history and purpose of the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee. Our target audience today are JJOC members, but we have invited other stakeholders to this live session, and then it will be made, the recording will be made available publicly once we are finished, hopefully by the end of this week. We have about an hour set aside. We'll be doing our presentation followed by a question and answer session. We ask that during the presentation you keep yourself muted and don't interrupt with your questions, but you can put them in the chat and I will keep track of those as we go through. Or you can save your questions and unmute yourself during the Q&A session. Van, will you advance to the next slide, please? The purpose of our one-on-one session today is to review three topic areas. First, how Utah's juvenile justice system got where it is now. Second, the purpose of the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee and how members can contribute to efforts. And third, how resources and information related to the juvenile justice reform in Utah can be accessed online. Our goal today is that JJOC members will have a better understanding of the group as a whole and of their role as a member. I am going to ask Van if you would advance it to the next slide, and I am going to hand it over to Brett Peterson from Juvenile Justice Youth Services to take it from here.
Thank you, Kaylee, and thank you also just committee members who I think put forward this recommendation to do a little one-on-one session as time goes by with reform. I think it's good to be grounded in the policy that drives a lot of our work, some of the foundational policy and some of the efforts and roles of Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee. So you can see, like, really this kind of timeline here, I think, are the most significant milestones overall relative to the kind of reform package. There are other policy efforts that are probably more directly related to, so for example, during this same time frame, there was policy around, where every youth is entitled to counsel, for example, or there was policy that tried to keep youth under 12 out of the juvenile justice system. Those are all very relevant policies, but this timeline here really kind of walks you through for the primary kind of juvenile justice policy package that was brought forward. So in 2016, Juvenile Justice Working Group was put forward. I think it was sponsored by, or was put forward or started with Governor, the President of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. Extensive working group, members, I think we'll cover that in a few slides, really trying to think of anybody who touched the juvenile justice system having voice representative in the effort. It started by a pretty extensive data dive. Then in 2017, this is a timeline, that's when House Bill 239 went into play. House Bill 132 in 2018, what that did is that adjusted some provisions. Initially, there were provisions that created, there was a couple things, but the main one was in 239, there was an absolute kind of ban on referrals to court for truancy. Based on stakeholder feedback and input, House Bill 132 adjusted that and created a pathway, which we have today that we operate under. And then House Bill 404, I feel like, was kind of the last piece in this package, which was our reinvestment account. And that enables us, at least as a division, to capture savings from reform to use it for reinvestment. If you go to the next slide. So it really was a data-driven effort. In Utah, I get the opportunity to be in a lot of groups and conversations nationally in juvenile justice in this space, and to a lesser degree, child welfare as well. One thing that Utah is really known for is our data in this space. We have really good juvenile justice data. It's from juvenile courts and JJYS and other stakeholders, so we really could get extensive on that. 32 stakeholders looking at public safety, limiting system cost, reducing recidivism, and improving outcomes for youth, families, and communities. Next slide. So these are, and I think these are really important. I mean, these conversations, these continue to go on to this day. When we looked at our data and Utah's data, and we could compare it to national data, when we looked at Utah's data, we saw that most of the youth in the system were in the system for low-level, low-risk offenses. There was inconsistent responses. We also found kind of that second bullet over on the left side. We could look at youth that were diverted versus youth that were incarcerated, and we could see what happened. And consistently, the youth who were incarcerated, higher reoffense rates. We saw a lot of youth were being placed out of home, whether it was in DCFS, in JJS at the time. A lot of them would end up out of home in like a residential treatment or even in my secure care facilities for essentially lot of low risk offenses. We would see kids in care. Oh, about half the kids in my care in secure care at times would be there for misdemeanors or even things like contempt. We saw significant disparities. We had a lack of services in rural areas. And then we just saw once a youth had any touch point, they kind of remained engaged in the system. Next slide. So the big lifts. House Bill 239, for some of you a lot of you have been around for that time frame. Some of you are newer to at least these circles, or maybe you were in a different role. But it really was, I mean, top to bottom, you know, as far as a reform effort. It touched almost everything in the juvenile justice system. So it created, you know, pretty clear, it made clear pathways for when a person could be placed in secure care. It standardized and made sure that diversion was available everywhere. It really made efforts to keep low-level school-based offenses out of court. As I talked about, there's still pathways, but making sure there's some diversions. It placed restrictions on lengths of stay. And when I say lengths of stay, that could be, you know, that probation length that says there in that fourth box on the top right, but also if they're under community supervision with my agency or in a facility, trying to create kind of some structure based on the research around lengths of stay. It also limited when a youth could be placed somewhere, strengthening supervision, augmenting responses to noncompliance. Let's see, I'm trying to move my box here. Is the other one I always want to kind of touch on, is this reinvest in community and evidence-based practices. That's kind of the work we've really been earnestly engaged in these last few years. And that was made more effective with our reinvestment account legislation that came later. Adjusting when a youth could be transferred to the adult system, and then creating increased oversight, you know, increased reporting requirements, and also creating the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee. If you go to the next slide. It was landmark, but I like these three buckets. The bill focused on intervening earlier, reducing out-of-home placements for first-time offenders. It strived to only use residential when youth posed a serious public safety risk. And I'll add into that, that could be a kid that comes into custody, but also a kid just for like detention also, you know, really using that framework. Like, look, we're not going to use it as a punitive measure. We're going to use it as a public safety response. If it's not meeting that, let's not do it, because our outcomes become a lot worse when we do. And then the last big bucket there in that landmark is establishing this oversight committee to report. And I think it goes to Van now.
Actually, this is Kaylee. I'm going to take back over for this section and then pass it off to Van. So the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee was created as part of statute in the original legislation that Brett mentioned, House Bill 239 back in 2017. The JJOC is part of the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, which is in the governor's office. And the JJOC oversees the implementation of reform efforts, and it also gathers and analyzes data on the impact of policy changes. Now, as Brett mentioned, the original legislation was back in 2017, and since then, each legislative session there has been a bill to make adjustments or tweak different aspects of the policy based on the evidence and data that we are gathering and analyzing. So reform isn't just a one and done task. It's certainly ongoing. You know, the major lift was HB 239, and since then we have just made adjustments along the way based on how things have been going and what's best for the state and the families and the youth in our communities. If you are interested in a full list of statutory responsibilities of the JJOC, you can find that in Utah Code. It is Utah Code 63M-7-208. The large JJOC group meets quarterly to review and report on those duties that are listed in statute. And then there are multiple working groups that meet as needed to look into specific topic areas, including risk assessments, truancy and absenteeism, and service availability and distribution statewide. Dan, will you advance the slide, please? Thank you. The JJOC members represent a variety of disciplines and expertise areas related to juvenile justice in Utah. So we have representatives from state agencies like Juvenile Justice Youth Services, Juvenile Court, the Utah State Board of Education. We also have community members and educators and general stakeholders, a wide array of folks. And member and public input is integral to the reform work. As I mentioned, it wasn't a one and done process in 2017. We continue to analyze the data and receive feedback from community members and stakeholders to make changes to the system as needed. JJOC does rely on members to act as conduits of communication from their agencies, organizations, and communities to the larger policy developing group, the main group, and the state legislature. Van, if you could advance it again, please. Thank you. These are the staff leadership folks of the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee: Brett Peterson, who you heard from, Patty Norman, who is a Deputy Superintendent of Student Achievement at the Utah State Board of Education. Next is myself, the Juvenile Justice Specialist with the Utah Board of Juvenile Justice, and also Van Wynn, who is a research consultant with the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. Next slide, please, and Van, I'll pass it along to you.
Thank you, Brett and Kaylee, for the wonderful background and really highlighting, you know, our role as the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, as well as kind of the responsibilities being a member on JJOC. And so this next part, we will be accessing our website where you can find all of the information and resources that we publish ongoing. And I want to say towards the end of the slideshow, we do post the website that you can access. And so in general, when you go to justice.utah.gov, on this tab here under divisions, you will go to juvenile justice and then click on Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, which lands you to our main webpage. And so this is the landing page. Here you'll get a little tidbit on who we are and what we are tasked to do. In the following sections, we do provide a transparency site as well as access to the latest annual report and really any, you know, rotating information that we want to highlight. On the bottom here, you can see everyone who is part of the committee, and we try to keep this updated as best that we can, but we know there are a lot of individuals moving in and out of leadership positions. At the top here, if you hover over to the secondary menu tab, you will see a section on our reports. And so if you want to look at the past 5 years annual report, you can find it here. And the annual report is something we are required to do statutorily on an annual basis. And we report on specific performance measures as highlighted in statute. So some of the main sections that Brett highlighted as the core components of what was in the HB 239 package, you will see that reflected in the annual report sections as well. This next tab over here, we do have a section for relevant research, and this could be, you know, something that the committee has sponsored, like the non-judicial adjustments that you may have heard the presentations in our past meetings. But it could also reference just, related work that is important to understanding juvenile justice reform and some recent literature and research on that particular topic. And the next tab over, you'll see some resources and partners. Public notices is where you can access the meeting minutes and recordings. And then the last section is archives. If you click on that, you can find the reports from the working group that Brett mentioned, a summary of that, a webinar back in 2018, as well as some highlighted topics such as truancy and the school offense referral guide. I'm going to focus on the main site here. So if we go to this transparency site, this is something I believe that all members should really take a thorough look into. What this transparency website shows is that this is also, open to the public so they can see what we are doing and where we are at in each statutory requirement that we were given and tasked to complete. And so we broke it into 9 main sections. So the first one is data and analysis. Second is assessment tools. Third is evidence-based approaches. Fourth is fines, fees, and restitution. 5 is performance-based contracts. 6 is reinvestment and structure. 7 is training. 8 is system improvements. And 9 is reducing disparities. And so if you click on, any one of these boxes, it will take you to a different page that shows what the requirement were listed in statute and the progress of each. And so here you can see that, we were tasked to assist AOC, Administrative Office of the Courts, in developing a statewide sliding scale for the assessment of fines, fees, and restitution. And so you can see here, we're about 95%, probably 95% completed. The working group that was developed back in fiscal year 2018 did develop the scale, and it is being updated on an annual basis. The courts are updating it on an annual basis. And then the primary tactical plans to complete this is, collecting and reporting on data about fines, fees, and restitution, and then completing a one-time or ongoing study about the impact of these court order obligations. And so it's really cool to see that we have completed this one-time study. And if we click on here, it will take us to the non-judicial adjustments, which was under relevant research, which, as I mentioned, the presentation was given in the past working group meeting. And so the non-judicial adjustments was one of the primary study focuses of JJOC at the time. So back in 2018, after the sliding fee scale was completed, and we contracted with the Utah Criminal Justice Center and the Economics Evaluation Unit at the University of Utah to help us complete this study area. And so if you look on this page, you can, get a background of what the non-judicial process and the flow chart of what that looks like within juvenile court. Here you will find, the primary research efforts in the areas of this topic area. And when you scroll down, you will see the completed report, both by the Utah Criminal Justice Center and the Economics Evaluation Unit. And so these little flip cards, you can get a little, background on what this report is about. But once you actually click on it, it will pop up the full report. And here on the bottom, you have the fines, fees, and restitution study, as well as a dashboard that the Economics Evaluation Unit developed. And so I know, there are some members who, this is a ton of information, but our recommendation is really take the time to explore the website, read the working group findings from that report, and then really focus in on the main policy areas that were enacted. In our annual reports, specifically, I want to say the 2018 annual report gives a really in-depth overview of all the policy changes that were made. And then the following annual reports became more brief just to, really provide an update on the performance metrics and the policy areas that were passed in 2017. Okay, I am go back to this presentation. Okay, and I think that is it for my portion, and I'll pass it back to Kaylee.
Thanks, Van, for walking us through the website and where those resources can be found. There on the screen, you can see that website that Van was accessing is justice.utah.gov. And as you're looking through that, or if you have questions regarding the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, you can email me at ktrichards@utah.gov. And at this point, Van, if you would move it one more slide forward, please. That concludes the presentation section of our time, and we're moving into questions. If you have a question, feel free to post it in the chat, or you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can call on you to unmute yourself. But if you have any questions about the presentation or just sort of general questions about the group or reform, now is the time.
Hi, this is Chief Marino. I'm
Yes.
just wondering, do we foresee having meetings or like our quarterly meetings in person again, or will we just be doing it all in Zoom?
That's a great question. Thanks, Chief Marino. That is something that we will talk about at the next JJOC meeting, which will actually be next Monday, October 17th at 1 p.m. It will be virtual, that meeting, but we will take up, it's the final meeting of this year for 2022. So we will take it up as an agenda item to see if the group would like to resume in-person meetings with an optional virtual attendance option starting in 2023. So to be determined.
Yeah, that would be a great idea. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And then I see David, you had a question?
Yeah, Kaylee. First of all, thank you so much for putting this together, you and your team. Question that I have, Kaylee, is I understand the statutory responsibilities of JJOC and the advice to look over the website is great. I'm just curious from your perspective and Van's perspective and Brett's perspective about the ongoing work of JJOC as far as the reform efforts and what you see as that the next steps or the ongoing conversations when it comes to juvenile justice reform.
Thanks, David. I am going to pass that to Brett. I think that's a perfect Brett question.
Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, I think it is a really good question, a really fair question too. I think that, we do have these kind of clear reporting requirements and, reporting, which also brings with it a degree of oversight. I think the conversation relative to, I think it would be really ideal for JJOC to be a body where also when there's issues that we're seeing that are things we're concerned about, that, we could bring them here. So I guess it's probably, David, it's probably a little bit of a blessing and a curse, but the statute, it's fairly flexible on the degree of oversight. It's like, hey, you have to do it and you have to do X, Y, and Z, but then it also has kind of some broad language as well. So I think those are things, from my perspective, I think there should hopefully be some conversation on. I do think now is probably the time to as we look maybe into 2023, it's really the time to do that, because I'll tell you a big difference or a change is up until, basically now, Representative Snow was kind of like the legislative partner on here and being the champion and the sponsor of all of the reform. He was always just kind of right at the table. So when issues would come up, he was either there addressing them, or he also would kind of, as Kaylee described, there's been little follow-on tweaks and changes every year. And we have been able to use this body to help kind of facilitate some of that. But I think that probably changes a little bit when your chief sponsor is not also on the committee of some of the reform package. So I think that'd be a good conversation, like as we look maybe towards some strategic kind of planning a little bit of like, hey, here's the main things we know we need to do. How do we want to make sure we're doing that? So is it, going through our reports together, and then how are we going to continue to kind of populate the agenda, as it were? The last thing I'll say is, like, for example, Van presented the non-judicial study. Like that's a prime example, I think, of what this body could do and do really, really well is, non-judicials, the scope of that type of diversion changed so dramatically with reform. So this body, was already looking at the data because they have to report it and receive that data. And then it was just natural to say, okay, then let's start asking some questions around how these are going. And so I think that's a really good example of how this body could function. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but and also Van, do you have any insight on that, Van? Anything you'd add to that?
Yes. And I would like to say, everything what you said, Brett, totally. And that's why we have the transparency site to kind of keep us on our toes. Meaning, when we look at the statutory requirements, you can see the progress we're making on each, but there are some where I think there needs to be a bigger emphasis. So for example, reducing disparities in the system. One of the original findings from the working group was that disparities continue to persist in the system, but it also is magnified once a youth gets deeper into the system. And even with reform changes, we have not seen a reduction in that, even though the volume of kids that are coming to the system have been down. But not to say that agencies aren't making efforts to look at that issue. I want to say there's things that, and Brett's team have been doing over at juvenile court. They have been looking into disparities, but we as a body of juvenile justice oversight committee can also continue looking at this, at the disparities, which is going to be part of the discussion for next week's meeting. As the non-judicial research has come to a close, meaning those studies were completed, there are some new questions that came from that as it pertains to minority overrepresentation in the system, but being underrepresented in the successful completions of these diversion opportunities. And so I think there is different paths we can take to explore that further. But I also really like what Brett said, that this body is also an open space where we have all the stakeholders at the table to really contribute our expertise and perspective on different topics as it relates to anything that touches the juvenile justice system.
Yeah, really well said, Van. I want to add on one other little thing is like another kind of maybe example also. Certainly we'll probably be, somewhat less effective if we're, kind of, I'll just say whack-a-mole or whatever, like just each issue that comes up, like, okay, let's just, we want to be a little more strategic. And also, I think it's okay to, as we see things, they're happening that do fall under kind of this umbrella to raise them. An example I'll use. So Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee is tasked with, overseeing this reform effort, and are these things being implemented? One of the areas that is a specific kind of called out responsibility is the establishment and availability of evidence-based services, and really looking at like a statewide access and availability question, right? So broadly, we know that's one of our tasks. Well, we've also had stakeholders who've raised very specific, like, okay, what about treatment for this population? Maybe a female population, or maybe youth with problematic sexual behavior, whatever it might be. I think that those things, we can also take those things on because they're certainly fitting under the umbrella of, hey, this is the stuff we're supposed to help advise. And now a very specific issue relative to that, those obligations are brought forward as well. So I think that there's space for both types of endeavors.
Thanks, Brett and Van. David, did you have any follow-up to that, or did that answer your question, I hope? Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions for our presentation today?
This is Carl Marino. Sorry to bother or intrude again. What authority or what role do we as a committee play in addressing changing laws that affect juveniles? I've seen a lot of stuff, but I haven't seen anything. And an example that I'm thinking of that I've run into recently, we see where juveniles can have their licenses suspended, and as they continue to have contact while they're driving, as they get older, that the suspension continues for X number of years, depending on when they get caught. And I recently ran into a young man who had his license suspended when he was 16. He's now 26, and he's still on that original suspension because it's been extended, and only because he's had it extended does it keep getting extended. He can't buy insurance. And I just wondered, do we have that ability to address laws that actually end up creating more problems instead of solving problems?
Yeah. Kaylee, do you want me to take a stab at that?
Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think this can be a good body to help inform policy. As issues like that, where I think there's a strength here is because of, the partners we have that, at CCJJ, and their abilities relative to research and, and also having the courts here and JJOS. So for example, that type of issue can be brought, we can easily, we've got a lot of the right stakeholders here where we can then pull together a working group and, we can pull some of the data on these types of issues. And then if we identify something that's outlying, that's not kind of in harmony, I think, with the policy, of juvenile reform, that's something that could be elevated. Or if something's just off, I think that's stuff that it seems it would be important for us to help connect those dots in informing that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chief. I'm sorry.
I just see an individual who, God forbid that when we were 16, we made mistakes, and it can continue for years and years into the adult system once the mistake is made as a juvenile. And I just, it's a twofold problem, but I just wonder what we have as far as an ability to address some things like this.
Yeah, and I think, Chief, thank you. This is a great example of and this is just kind of reiterating what Brett said, great example of the kind of issue items that the group could take on. And Chief, if you don't mind, I'm going to follow up with you afterwards via email. But when our stakeholders, when our JJOC members have issues like the one that you presented, we hope that they get brought to the group so that they can be elevated if necessary. We can pull data on them to see sort of how widespread this issue is. This is exactly that sort of conduit of communication that we're hoping members get involved in, so that in your communities geographically, or the different factions of communities that you're part of based on your personal interests or your profession, that information can be brought back and awareness can be raised about it, and perhaps something can be done about it. So this is a prime example of that communication back and forth that we're definitely looking for. And Chief, I will follow up with you after this session and see what we can do.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Of course.
And Kaylee, I'll just add something. And I think it could also be done in a different route as well, as other members of the group have done. Like, for example, our lovely Pam Vickery, has passion about fines and fees. And so she has worked closely with, I believe, Senator Weiler to try to get some legislation passed on that particular issue. But she has brought forth that issue to JJOC to kind of gain the members' perspective and expertise and provide any input where they can. So it doesn't directly have to come out of our group in terms of, we develop the working group, but if it's something that, you as a member want to work on a particular topic with a sponsor of the bill and then bring it to the group to kind of, get perspective, that's totally doable as well.
Yeah, it seems like, Van, it seems like that's probably even the most common. Like, other than like, we have, I feel like, been a more prominent voice on, certainly on cleanup items, things that are just like directly tied right into that kind of that original legislative package, into those original kind of mandates of the JGLC. But then it certainly has been, it's been a forum where, we've had lots of different pieces of legislation that are brought forward by either members of this committee or others, just to get perspective of the members here.
And sorry, one more point. And I believe that this group, we never have taken any official voting positions on legislation that relates to, juvenile justice issues. But Kaylee and her Utah Board of Juvenile Justice group do. And so I think that's the great thing of, having Kaylee and I as staff to this group, as well as Utah Board of Juvenile Justice, is that there are a lot of crossovers in terms of, different juvenile justice topics. And so the Utah Board of Juvenile Justice do have a legislative working group where they tackle on specific issues throughout the year, and then they take official positions every year, and that gets forwarded to the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, which then gets forwarded to all of the legislators during the general session.
Yeah, that's absolutely another great avenue for participation. Thanks for mentioning that, Van. All right, I'm going to do another call for questions. So a couple people pop on their camera, so I thought maybe they wanted to talk, or maybe they just wanted to share their faces, which is also fantastic. All right. Well, last call for questions. Otherwise, we are going to wrap it up. Van, would you mind going back one slide for the contact information, please? If you have anything that comes up after, oh, I see someone unmuted themselves. Mr. Yazzie, did you have a question?
Yeah, Kaylee, first of all, I appreciate the presentation.
Sure.
Helps to clarify a lot of things here for me. So, with my work here in Provo School District, Diversity and Equity Coordinator, and then my past work working with tribes, and I'm glad to see James Toledo and Dustin Jansen here in this meeting as well. How do you feel comfortable with how this committee works with our communities of color around the state, getting their perspective? I mean, do you feel like there's a real good communication foundation to get that feedback, perspective when issues come out or come up that definitely impacts our communities of color and our tribal communities and so forth? I mean, do we have, because in my past work, when I was with the Boys and Girls Club, and when I would work with juvenile justice, that was one of the things that was really frustrating with states, is that it just seems like there wasn't really a good communication plan with all of these various groups. And it kind of seemed like, it was one particular group kind of making the decision for everybody. And so I'm just kind of wondering if this committee feels comfortable with how it communicates to get those perspectives. And because there's a variety of people here on this, in this meeting that I know, and that's great to see. But just ongoing, do you feel comfortable that we have a good communication plan?
Thanks, Brian, for asking that question. And my answer is it is a plan or an approach that can always be strengthened. And especially as we are taking a specific focus, as Van mentioned, on some of those red racial and ethnic disparities issues that we still see within the system, we want to incorporate the perspectives of people who work in the system, parents who have children in the system, youth themselves in the system. So we are always looking for avenues and partnerships to strengthen that communication. If you have any ideas, we would certainly welcome them. We also have another kind of colleague group, I guess, or adjacent group to the JJOC and the Utah Board of Juvenile Justice is the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Advisory Committee. Many of the folks, there's a significant Venn diagram of folks who sit on one or more of those groups and participate in their efforts. And so through our collaboration with the RAD Advisory Committee, we hope that we are getting representative perspectives as this work moves forward. But I will say, I always think that there is more that can be done. And I would welcome any input or feedback or advice on how to do that differently.
Yeah, I would, and the reason why I bring this question up is, all of you are doing, amazing work, but, people change, communities change, groups change. And I think it would be important to have something written down just for the fact of just that this is what's in place, this is what's working. And so it's not creating something brand new all over again. Or, if any of you leave or, new faces come about and there's nothing written in place, then, it just kind of goes back to square one and we're kind of trying to scratch our heads figuring out how to communicate. Alicia does a great job with the RED committees. But once again, though, I just see when changes take place and nothing is written down, it's just kind of goes away. And that's, and this work needs to stay consistent. And if it's not consistent, then we're just kind of going backwards again. So that's just kind of an idea that I wanted just to bring up, because again, my past work when I worked directly with states in this area, that just communication is just the biggest problem that I have seen when it comes to this work. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, Brian.
I also think too, Brian, thank you for your thoughts. I was thinking an idea or possibility, Kaylee and Van, maybe we can brainstorm a little or discuss with the exec group, the exec committee, or bring it back to the full group, like looking like towards 2023, maybe do a little bit of strategic planning around some of these things. I think we've definitely said, okay, we know here's the mandates, here's what we want to kind of tackle for this year, but then we could add in like some kind of tactics to it. Like, so for example, we know we have, racial and ethnic disparities is one of the charges of reform. We know that's something that the group has consistently said, okay, this is continuing to be a challenge. What are then the strategic efforts we can start engaging in, and so like to Brian's point, maybe it's just, tactic one is we're going to make sure we get feedback from X, Y, or Z. And so maybe we can start putting a little more meat on the bones to some of those efforts. That might be a worthwhile effort.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, you've got the contact information there up on the screen, justice.utah.gov, or you can email me directly at ktrichards@utah.gov. This is our last call for questions. Raise your hand, unmute yourself. Going once, going twice. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us.